What if an old letter, hidden away for years, suddenly found its way back to the surface? And when this letter uncovered secrets long buried, would you try to hide it, or face the truth head on? This is the story of a mystery that reveals itself in unexpected ways, and of a sundial that once symbolized death, now standing as a reminder of truth's return. But is truth ever truly discovered so easily? Can we really turn the shadows of our past into light? In this battle for what's right, you'll have to see it with your own eyes. Are you ready? It was a Wednesday afternoon wrapped in a hush so complete that even the wind seemed reluctant to stir, as if Elmridge Hollow itself were holding its breath. In this quiet cocoon of routine and roses, Miss Henrietta Langford, a retired governess whose eyes missed nothing, and whose silences often said more than words, decided to pay a visit to her old companion, Mrs. Prudence Alcott. Mrs. Alcott, a widowed keeper of both secrets and sprawling rosebeds, had lately been speaking in subdued tones about her newest lodger, a Mr. Nathaniel Greaves, a man whose presence lingered like a shadow across her otherwise cheerful cottage. "There's something too still about him," she had murmured once, while trimming dead heads from her blooms, "like a clock that ticks, but not quite in time." The first time Miss Langford saw him, he moved through the room with the soundless precision of someone trained not to be noticed, each footstep placed deliberately, each motion deliberate but absent of life. His eyes, gray, but dulled like fogged glass, never quite settled on anything, as if everything he saw was either beneath his attention or already known. He dressed like a man who knew the rules of fashion but no longer played the game, immaculately neat, yet distinctly out of season, as though he were dressing not for today, but for a day already past. When spoken to, his replies were soft, nearly apologetic, each word weighed as if language were a dangerous thing to handle too carelessly. He claimed to be researching the symbolic relevance of antique barometers, but no one had ever seen him write, and the books he read were always closed when someone entered the room. His room, according to Mrs. Alcott, bore no sign of life, just a perfectly made bed, a single trunk arranged with geometric precision, and a wardrobe so lightly used that dust lingered on unused hangers. His nightly walks had begun to worry the villagers. He left just after sunset, never with a coat even in chill, and returned near midnight, shoes damp, his expression neutral, lips pressed together as though he was still listening to something long after it had stopped. Letters arrived every Wednesday, pale envelopes slipped under the door in silence, bearing no return address and sealed with a faint crescent-shaped mark on the flap. He never opened them in anyone's presence, and by morning they had vanished entirely. The baker's wife said he would often stand for minutes in front of the sundial in the village square, his gaze locked on the shadow as if waiting for it to shift in a particular way. The postmistress swore she once saw him stop suddenly at the base of the war memorial, and just stand there, not in reverence, but like someone retracing an old memory, measuring distances with his eyes. Mrs. Alcott once awoke to the sound of the gate creaking open well past midnight, only to glimpse him standing motionless beneath the garden archway, staring not ahead but upward, toward nothing. When questioned, he simply offered a gentle smile, and said he had trouble sleeping during certain phases of the moon. Miss Langford didn't find that odd. What she found disturbing was how practiced that smile was, how even his peculiarities seemed choreographed. He wasn't a man hiding secrets, she thought. He was a man built from them, as if each habit, each sentence had been rehearsed for a role no one else understood. There is, she later remarked to the butcher's wife, a subtle but crucial difference between a man who avoids being seen, and one who has trained himself not to exist. And in Mr. Greaves, she saw not a lodger, but a presence waiting, patiently, precisely, for something unspoken to arrive, or something long buried to stir once more in the soil of Elmridge Hollow, where memories fade but never fully vanish. It began with a whisper of fog drifting low through the hollow lanes of Elderbrook, the kind of creeping mist that blurred boundaries between field and forest, shadow and shape, truth and the echoes of what had once been. At the edge of the village, nestled among unruly hemlock and overgrown laurel hedges, stood the long-abandoned Windermere house, and within its crumbling perimeter walls, hidden under the smothering weight of ivy and silence, lay the forgotten sundial court, a sunless patch of cracked stone, where time had once been watched with reverence, and now only by one, Mr. Aldous Gray, the village's most recent and least understood resident, had taken to visiting the courtyard each afternoon at precisely 4:07, neither a minute early nor late, always alone, his tall frame draped in charcoal overcoats, despite the late summer warmth, his fingers curled tightly around a leather-bound journal he never opened in public. No one knew where he came from, only that he had arrived on a rain-slicked Tuesday with a single trunk, no luggage tags, and a quietness so dense it seemed to absorb the very sound of the postmistress's greeting. The villagers, polite but curious, noted his meticulous habits, his tea at 3:30, his walks down Holloway Lane, always ending at the moss-choked sundial, whose markings had long worn away under wind and time. One evening, as the wind rose with the peculiar urgency of an oncoming storm, Mrs. Dalloway, who rented the upper rooms of Ashcroft House to Mr. Gray, passed by his door and paused, compelled by the low tremor of whispered conversation from within. No guests had been admitted, yet she heard the strained murmur of a voice not quite speaking, but reciting words lost to age, except one name, soft and bitter like smoke, Catherine. The next morning, her voice low with unease, she confided the incident to Miss Isabel Hartley, the former headmistress and a woman of scholarly skepticism, but not without her own superstitions. Miss Hartley did not dismiss the tale, nor the name, but instead reflected on an earlier moment, how 3 days prior, she had seen Mr. Gray standing before the sundial in unmoving silence, staring down at the stone as if awaiting an answer to a question the rest of the world had forgotten how to ask. It was, she said, not a vigil, but a ritual, deliberate, rehearsed, as if he feared what would happen if he didn't return. In the following days, subtle oddities began to stack like bricks in a story no one had volunteered to tell. The church organist reported that the key to the vestry had gone missing, only to be found hours later resting atop the old stone ledger of the unmarked graves behind the chapel. Miss Harriet Wells, the apothecary's niece, confessed in a half-joke that she had glimpsed Mr. Gray near the abandoned gardener's shed, clutching what looked like weathered parchment or perhaps a folded map, something he hastily concealed when he noticed her watching. And then came young Arthur Penrose's discovery. While searching for his lost ball near the edge of the woods, he found a freshly dug hollow in the earth, no more than a foot deep, and within it, wrapped in oilskin, a broken silver brooch, and a torn photograph, faded nearly to nothing, but for the inked name on the back, Catherine H. Denby, 1887. The boy's mother dismissed it as relics from the old estate, but Miss Hartley, upon hearing the name, stiffened visibly. Denby had been the maiden name of the girl who vanished from Elderbrook, nearly 40 years ago, the last recorded visitor to Windermere House, before it was sealed after a fire. No one fully explained. Miss Hartley, shaken but composed, said nothing to the others, but that night, she took the broken brooch, and placed it beside her family's old copy of the village registry. Gray, she now realized, had signed his tenant form with a different surname, but his handwriting bore the same angular slant as the letters in the photo's inscription. And so, as dusk fell again over the village, and the mist began to crawl back through the hedgerows, Miss Hartley sat by the window, watching the path to the sundial, where Mr. Gray stood once more, motionless, as if time would eventually open its mouth and confess the truth he had been waiting all these years to hear. As the cold of September settled over the village of Cormore, the air carried a subtle chill, like something hidden beneath the earth was trying to make its way to the surface. That evening, as dusk draped the village in shadow, an old oil lamp flickered faintly in Mr. Grayson's study, a small dimly lit room in his new home on Rosewood Lane, which had only recently become his retreat. Mr. Grayson had arrived in the village 2 months prior, seeking solitude, a man whose past was hidden in the quiet depths of his eyes. The villagers, in their quiet, watchful manner, had already deemed him an enigma, For while his speech was cold, there was something deeply unsettling about the way he held himself. Every evening without fail, he would leave his house precisely at 4:17 p.m. and walk toward the village's oldest section, the crumbling ruins of Lakerton Garden, where an abandoned sundial stood, surrounded by overgrown weeds and the faint echo of forgotten summers. It was a place most villagers avoided, save for a few old-timers who remembered when it had been a lovely garden. Mrs. Caldwell, always knitting and listening to the village's every word, had been passing by the sundial when she saw Mr. Grayson one afternoon. He stood there, his gaze distant, his hand raised as though trying to catch something in the air, but he said nothing. The moment passed quickly, but the air seemed heavier afterward, and Mrs. Caldwell could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, during a quiet conversation at the bakery, Miss Thistlethwaite, who considered herself the village's unofficial historian, spoke of an odd discovery. Her nephew, Toby, the village postman, had reported that every morning, without fail, Mr. Grayson would receive a plain envelope, ivory-colored with black ink, no return address. Toby had seen it numerous times, and each time, Mr. Grayson handled the letter with an almost reverent care. He never responded, never sent anything in return, and most strangely, after reading it, she would burn it in his stove, tearing the paper into strips before watching it disintegrate into ash. The mystery deepened when Miss Thistlethwaite, one afternoon, made a quiet trip to Mr. Grayson's house. With no one around, she slipped through the back gate, and there she found something that made her heart race, a faint trail, a series of dragged marks leading to a forgotten window. As she peered through the glass, she saw Mr. Grayson sitting at a desk, turning the pages of a book, but something was off. His movements were deliberate, as if he were tracing the lines of something he had already read hundreds of times. She could see him picking up a photograph that upon closer inspection, appeared to be of a woman in a faded blue dress, long since lost to time. His hands trembled slightly, as he set the photograph down, then picked it up again, staring at it with a mixture of reverence and sorrow. Miss Thistlethwaite felt a chill creep down her spine, and without further hesitation, she left the premises, but the image of that woman haunted her. The next week, during a quiet Sunday service at the vicarage, a curious thing happened. An item was reported missing, a framed photograph of a woman, much like the one Mr. Grayson had been gazing at. It had been a gift to the church from a woman many years ago, a portrait that had hung in the small prayer room for decades. When Miss Thistlethwaite heard of this, a memory stirred in her mind. She recalled a name she had seen in an old parish record, one that made her blood run cold: Lysandra. The name rang a bell, for Lysandra had vanished from the village years ago. Her disappearance, a mystery that was never solved. Some said she had simply left, but others whispered that her body had never been found. In the old diary Miss Thistlethwaite had once stumbled across, she remembered a line written in fading ink: "He said time would bring me back." With this unsettling thought gnawing at her, Miss Thistlethwaite returned home that evening, her heart heavy with the weight of the secrets she had uncovered. She could no longer deny the unsettling pattern, the letters, the photograph, the strange rituals, and it was clear that Mr. Grayson was hiding something buried in the past, tied to a name and a woman who had left more than just memories behind. The longer she thought about it, the more she was convinced that time, with all its cruelty and patience, had not only brought Mr. Grayson back to the village, it had brought the ghosts of the past with him. Time, after all, had a way of resurfacing, unbidden and relentless, and Miss Thistlethwaite knew that some secrets never truly died. They simply waited, sometimes for years, until the moment was right. The quiet village of Ashcombe had always seemed immune to the chaos of the outside world, its cobblestone streets and ivy-clad cottages, exuding a calmness that felt almost timeless. But as autumn's chill began to settle in, a darker atmosphere crept in, unnoticed by the unsuspecting villagers. It was in this quiet place that Miss Eliza Crane, a woman of restrained elegance, had taken residence a few months ago, claiming to have come for a fresh start, though there was something unsettling about her arrival. No one had questioned her, for she came bearing the marks of refinement, the kind of mystery that suited the village's sleepy nature. However, there was always an undercurrent of unease. especially as she kept to herself, and never seemed to form connections. The villagers whispered, and it didn't take long for the story of her past to surface, a tale steeped in scandal, though no one could confirm it. The name Eliza Crane had been on the tip of many tongues, but more familiar to their memories was Elliot Marston, a London man of high society, who had once been at the heart of a tragic scandal. A young woman, known for her impeccable family background, had taken her life under mysterious circumstances, and though Elliot had never been convicted, the suspicion that lingered around him had been enough to shatter his once promising social standing. He had disappeared, as if swallowed by the city itself. The name, however, remained in the shadows, like a stitch dropped from the fabric of history. Crane's arrival seemed a mere coincidence. But as the days passed, Miss Wilkinson, the village's unofficial historian, could not ignore the similarities. The same refined manner, the same closed-off air, the same reluctance to engage with the villagers. As Miss Wilkinson's curiosity grew, she made discreet inquiries, carefully listening to the unspoken and the forgotten, picking at the threads of gossip like a seasoned detective. The connections were subtle at first. Miss Crane's past was a blank canvas, but one that seemed oddly familiar. No family visited her, no letters from distant friends, no records of her life before Ashcombe. She moved like someone retracing the steps of a life once lived under a different name. It was on a late afternoon in October that the first sign came, subtle and almost unnoticeable. A letter arrived, not addressed to Miss Crane, but to a name that was both familiar and ghostly, Marion Cresswell. The handwriting was the same, meticulously elegant, but the name belonged to a woman long deceased. Miss Wilkinson, ever so observant, caught sight of the envelope before it was swiftly replaced, and in that moment, the pieces fell into place. The name Marion Cresswell had been whispered in connection with a similar scandal, one that had torn apart the London social scene years before. The scandal surrounding Marion's death was unsolved, and there were rumors that Elliot Marston, now perhaps Mr. Crane, was somehow involved. But the truth had always been buried beneath layers of silence. Later that evening, Miss Wilkinson's attention was drawn to Miss Crane's residence. Through the veil of darkness, she noticed the faint glow of a single candle in the window. The smoke from the chimney rose in a steady column, but it was not the fire she studied. It was the subtle, eerie presence of the letter that troubled her. Who, she thought, would receive letters addressed to the dead, unless they were hoping to hear from them? The following morning, the village awoke to horror, when Elsie, the young maid at Mrs. Weatherby's estate, was discovered lying motionless by the sundial in the garden. Her hands were clenched tightly around something cold and metallic, a pocket watch, its hands frozen at 6:17. No one could explain how she had ended up there, and no one could explain the strange, unearthly calmness that seemed to hang in the air. Dr. Pendleton, the village physician, examined the body with grave concern, but it was Miss Wilkinson who noticed the details others missed. Elsie's shoes were untouched by the dew of the morning, clean as if she had never walked there at all. She hadn't stumbled, she had been placed, and the watch, why would she have died, clutching a watch that belonged neither to her nor anyone in the house? It was the very same time, 6:17, that had appeared on the watch when Elliot Marston had last been seen in London before his disappearance. Miss Wilkinson, feeling a chill that went deeper than the morning mist, made a note to herself. There was a story being told here, a story that had been hidden for far too long, and she was beginning to uncover it. But what she didn't yet understand was whether this was the start of a new chapter, or the closing of an old one. All she knew was that Ashcombe's quiet peace was about to be shattered, and the roots of something much darker were stirring beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. And the more she listened, the more certain she became. Some ghosts, it seemed, were not content to stay buried. By the following morning, the village of St. Mary Me had fallen into an eerie silence, a sense of unease clinging to the air like a dense fog, suffocating the usual hum of daily life. It was as though every resident had collectively drawn in a breath, waiting, anticipating the next unspoken event, the next fracture in their serene world. Dr. Pendleton, his usually calm demeanor strained by the day's grim revelation, confirmed what many had feared. Elsie had been poisoned. Digitalis, a subtle, treacherous substance, had coursed through her veins. A slow death masked by the appearance of an accident. The poison, derived from the common foxglove plant, was something familiar in its surroundings, yet utterly lethal when used with intent. The villagers, already ill at ease with the death of a young woman in their midst, whispered grimly about murder. This was no simple tragedy. It was a breach of their quiet existence, a dark mark on their otherwise peaceful lives. But as Miss Marple listened to their murmurs, her mind worked through the tangled threads of the mystery. It wasn't just how Elsie had died that mattered, it was the why, and more importantly, who had been the intended victim. The poison had been administered with care, precision, like a carefully orchestrated plan, and this alone sent ripples of suspicion through the village, particularly when Miss Marple recalled the peculiar details. An antique watch found in Elsie's lifeless grip, its golden face etched with strange marks, and the chilling fact that no one seemed to know where it had come from. The same watch, she thought, that could have been placed in Elsie's hands as a message, or perhaps to implicate her in something far darker. Crane, who had once again slipped into the background of village life, now became the focus of her thoughts. His detached responses to the inquiries, his lack of concern at being questioned, and the peculiar way he folded his hands when asked about Elsie's possessions made her wonder, was he truly innocent, or was he playing a far more dangerous game? His calmness, the absence of outrage at the accusation, suggested someone who had become familiar with suspicion, someone who had learned the art of silence. The timing of Elsie's death was troubling, too. It had occurred during a time when Mr. Crane had been away, on one of his long deliberate walks through the woods, as he always did. But Mrs. Weatherby, the ever-watchful hostess, had confirmed his absence from the house, leaving Elsie alone with the room to herself. And there, Miss Marple mused, with her quiet, insistent curiosity, Elsie had uncovered something, perhaps something that had been left behind carelessly, or maybe something she was meant to find. But whatever it was, Miss Marple was certain that the girl hadn't stumbled upon it by accident. The antique watch, too fine for a village maid to own, seemed out of place in the girl's simple possession. The fact that it had been clutched so tightly in death, rather than hidden away, spoke volumes. There was a message in that act, and Miss Marple could feel it lurking in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. When she quietly requested to see Elsie's belongings later that afternoon, it wasn't out of a desire for prying, but rather to confirm something her instincts had whispered to her. There was a reason behind the girl's actions, a reason that went far deeper than anyone had yet realized. It was then that Miss Marple, with her keen eye for detail, noted the shoes, placed carefully beside Elsie's modest trunk, shoes that had been worn that very day, shoes whose soles were untouched by dirt, as though they had been worn for a brief moment before being carefully set aside. The unspoken question lingered in the air. Who had Elsie been meant to meet, and why had she been left to die, so quietly, under the watchful eyes of a house that held more secrets than anyone had yet begun to unravel? By morning, the quiet that had descended over St. Mary Me, thick with shock, shifted into something more watchful, an uneasy tension hanging in the air like the stillness before a storm. The villagers moved with a restrained caution, as if expecting something to snap, to break open the fragile veil that had once shielded them. Dr. Pendleton, his face as tight as the string of a bow pulled too taut, confirmed the cause of Elsie's death. Digitalis, a potent poison, as deadly as it was unremarkable in appearance, hidden in the delicate beauty of the foxglove flower, something that might easily be overlooked in the most unassuming of gardens, yet something lethal in the wrong hands. It was clear that this was no accident. It had been carefully prepared and administered with precision, like a silent promise of death. The word poison hung heavily in the air, and with it the word murder quickly followed. The village, accustomed to squabbles over trivial matters like misplaced bicycles, or the best sponge cake recipe, recoiled at the thought that one of their own, or someone from within their ranks, had wielded such a weapon. It was an alien kind of violence, an intrusion into their peaceful world that shook them to the core. For Miss Marple, however, It was not the method of Elsie's death that captivated her mind. It was the why. The why twisted the story into something more sinister, a question that lingered in the air like an unspoken truth. Her thoughts returned again and again to the peculiar details. The locked drawer, the envelope addressed to a woman long dead, and the watch, an antique timepiece far too precious for a servant. Could it be that Elsie had stumbled upon something not meant for her, something dangerous? Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the poison hadn't been intended for Elsie at all, but for someone else. The search for answers led Miss Marple to Mr. Crane, whose calm detachment seemed as much a shield as it was a mask. He had been walking as usual, along the western edge of the woods, where the blackberries had not yet ripened. He had passed no one, carried no watch, and his alibi, corroborated by Mrs. Weatherby, was airtight. But Miss Marple noticed something more subtle beneath his composure. A certain stillness, a tightness around his eyes, as though he were already bracing for the questions he knew were coming. When he asked, with an odd sort of resignation, if Elsie had owned anything unusual, it was the phrasing, not the question itself, that caught Miss Marple's attention. It spoke of a man who had long since learned the art of silence, of a man accustomed to suspicion. He did not ask how Elsie had died, only what she had found. And then came the revelation: Elsie had been cleaning the guest room that very morning, not her usual assignment. She had asked specifically to tend to that room, citing the need to freshen up the corners. It was a harmless enough request, but something about it now struck Miss Marple as odd. Why had Elsie wanted to clean that room, particularly when Mr. Crane was absent, as he often was on his walks? The key, Miss Marple suspected, lay in what Elsie might have found while alone in that room, with time and curiosity on her side. Weatherby, though she reported no disturbances in the room, had mentioned that Elsie was thorough, sometimes too much so, often straightening things that were not crooked. It wasn't much to go on, but Miss Marple's mind was already piecing it together. Elsie had found something, and whatever it was, it had been important enough to her to keep. It was in her hand when she died. This watch, an item far too fine for a servant girl, far too sentimental to be discarded carelessly. Miss Marple, with her characteristic delicacy, requested to see Elsie's personal effects, not out of prying curiosity, but to ensure the girl had all she needed, everything she was owed. What she found, however, was not a photograph or trinket, but a subtle clue in the form of shoes. Shoes so meticulously clean, they seemed almost untouched by the earth of the garden, the damp soil where Elsie's body had been found. No trace of the garden's morning dew, no sign of wear on the soles, not even an indentation on the heels. If the shoes had remained pristine, then Elsie had not walked to the sundial. In fact, she had not walked there at all. She had been moved, and moved after death, her body placed with deliberate intention, meant to be found, not hidden. That single, seemingly inconspicuous detail unraveled the narrative, shifting everything from a random act of violence to a calculated murder. The realization sent a chill down Miss Marple's spine. The more she thought about it, the more she understood. This was not an impulsive act, but a well-thought-out plan, a scheme wrapped in layers of careful design. It was cruelty masquerading as civility. The villagers began to murmur, and the whispers found their voice in Mrs. Crouch, who had overheard Elsie 2 days before her death, boasting with a strange mixture of defiance and pride, saying she had found something that could ruin someone's life. At the time, Mrs. Crouch had assumed it was a trivial matter, perhaps a young girl's flirtation, or a minor staff squabble, but now, with Elsie dead, those words reverberated through the village, like a silent bell tolling a grim truth. Miss Marple's thoughts deepened. Elsie had not been frightened when she spoke those words. She had been proud. And that pride, that dangerous belief that she held something with power, was the key. Power, in a place where it was scarce, could make a person feel invincible. But it was also a fatal temptation. The question now was not what Elsie had found, but whom it had threatened. The watch, the strange letters, the locked drawer of metals, these were pieces of a larger puzzle. A puzzle that threatened to expose a truth too painful for someone to face. Miss Marple, always meticulous in her deductions, rose from her chair, a quiet sigh escaping her lips. It was clear now it was not Elsie's curiosity that had killed her. It was the dangerous game of secrets and power she had unwittingly become a part of. Miss Marple had never been one to interfere lightly, but when the world tilted into something darker, something wrong, she knew it was time to act. And so she turned to an old acquaintance, Sir Geoffrey Halberton, a retired judge whose clarity of thought had helped her unravel more than one tangled knot in her time. She wrote to him discreetly, not mentioning death or poison, only the name, Elliot Marston. The reply was swift, and in it, Sir Geoffrey confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. Elliot Marston, now known as Mr. Elliot Crane, was no stranger to scandal. His past had been marked by a girl named Marian Creswell, a tragedy that had left nothing but silence in its wake. But there had been no charges, no arrests, only the vanishing of a young man who had escaped not justice, but memory. Miss Marple sat quietly, absorbing the weight of Sir Geoffrey's words. It was not guilt that had driven him to disappear. It was the absence of a defense. As Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, placing it beside her knitting basket, she understood that memory had a way of finding its way back, especially when it was tied to something, and someone too significant to be forgotten. Her name had once been Marian Creswell, a name that had belonged to the tragic heroine of a story much larger than herself. Her death, though a quiet affair, had spiraled into a scandal that sent shockwaves through high society, not because suicides among the well-bred were rare, but because of the unsettling circumstances surrounding hers. What truly elevated this tragedy into a scandal was the presence of a man, Elliot Marston. He was a history lecturer, 10 years older than Marian, and by every account her closest confidant. Their relationship, never openly acknowledged, but whispered about in the most exclusive circles, became the focal point of rampant speculation. The nature of their bond was obscured, with the contents of a cryptic letter being the only tangible clue left behind. Smudged, illegible, but undeniably potent. Whispers suggested that Marian had intended to flee her gilded cage, perhaps to expose some deep hidden truth within the powerful Creswell family. The Creswells weren't just well respected. They were influential, the very fabric of the local aristocracy. Any hint of scandal was a threat to everything they had carefully constructed over the years. The letter, never fully understood but too mysterious to ignore, had become the catalyst for a storm of speculation. Had Marian been planning to run away, to reveal secrets that no one dared to speak of? Had she, in a final act of defiance, chosen to take her life in order to silence the unbearable weight of those secrets? The answers were locked away, as was the truth about Elliot Marston, who was never formally questioned, never formally charged. He was simply gone, evaporating into the shadows as quietly as the rumors had spread. He had been neither absolved nor condemned by the courts. Instead, he became the subject of hushed conversations, a man whose reputation had been forever tainted by association with a scandal that no one dared to fully acknowledge. Miss Marple, as sharp-eyed and perceptive as ever, observed the situation with a sense of quiet detachment. She gathered fragments from Sir Geoffrey's letters, pieced together whispers and vague recollections, and slowly, a different narrative began to form. There had been no formal inquest, no thorough investigation into the cause of Marian's death, just a swift, almost convenient dismissal of it as a tragedy caused by a fragile, troubled young woman. The Creswell family, in their power and influence, had ensured that the matter was laid to rest with minimal fuss. The letter Marian had left behind, though potentially revealing, was deemed unintelligible, a casualty of time and smudged ink, and was sealed away, never to be examined again. Elliot Marston, as swiftly as he had arrived in Marian's life, vanished from it, never to return to public view. His disappearance was both expected and accepted, an eerie quiet that matched the silence surrounding Marian's death. But Miss Marple, never one to accept a convenient conclusion, found herself wondering. She could sense that something remained hidden, a presence long absent but far from forgotten. Years later, under the new name of Elliot Crane, he reappeared in a quiet village, where civility reigned supreme, and questions were a dangerous currency. He came with no fanfare, No announcement, just a subtle shift in the air, as his presence was noticed once more. He had aged, of course, but something in his manner, his precise way of speaking, suggested a man who had learned that truth, for all its power, sometimes did not serve the living. With the passing of time, secrets had a way of becoming more dangerous, not because they were harder to uncover, but because they had time to settle, to entangle themselves in the very bones of those who had carried them. The village, with its respect for tradition, and its abhorrence of unanswered questions, would not have tolerated someone like Elliot Crane, had they known the full extent of his past. But he came in silence, a man changed, carrying with him not just the memory of Marian, but the weight of something far darker, the secret of her death, long buried beneath a sundial in a forgotten garden. Miss Marple, with her finely honed ability to perceive the unspoken, watched him from afar. She noticed not just his words, but the spaces between them, the pauses where silence spoke louder than any confession. It wasn't justice that Miss Marple sought in those moments, but understanding. There was a quiet sorrow in her observations, for she understood that some wounds were not just deep. They were wounds that had never been allowed to heal, wounds that had been kept open by the weight of silence. And now, years later, silence had returned, manifesting itself once more in the tragic death of a young maid, who had stumbled upon something she should not have known. What had once been a faint echo of Marian's name had now returned, not as an accusation, but as a quiet haunting cry of loss. As Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Weatherby one afternoon, sipping tea and allowing the conversation to drift, she guided it toward an innocent enough topic: wedding gifts. "I recall a most unusual clock," she mused lightly, as though the thought had only just occurred to her. "A beautiful French mantelpiece, with a hidden drawer beneath the dial. I've never seen anything quite like it." Mrs. Weatherby, her mind elsewhere, replied without hesitation, "I too possess such a thing. It was a wedding present from my late husband's uncle. Charming, isn't it?" The conversation seemed to end there, but Miss Marple's mind was already racing. The clock, with its hidden compartment, seemed so ordinary, yet she felt a strange sense of unease, a suspicion that this innocuous object might hold more than just sentimental value. The maid's death had struck Miss Marple as too coincidental. She suspected that the quiet unspoken truths of the past, the unresolved questions surrounding Marian's death, Elliot Marston's disappearance, the Creswell family's carefully maintained image, were beginning to stir. Like a hand rising from beneath the sundial, the past had not been content to remain buried. It was clawing its way to the surface, seeking the light, not for the sake of vengeance, but for the sake of release. And now, in the silence that followed Marian's death, in the silence that had shrouded the truth for so long, it was clear that something, or someone, had finally broken through. Miss Marple knew that justice was not always served by the law. Sometimes, it was the quiet, patient observer, who saw the truth for what it was, long after others had turned away. She had learned that silence, while a powerful tool, was also a cage. And now, in that same silence, the story of Marian Creswell, and perhaps even Elliot Marston, was about to be told, once and for all. Miss Marple sat still, her tea cooling in front of her, as the morning light filtered through the curtains. The day had started innocently enough, with the usual pleasantries exchanged over breakfast, but beneath the surface, a storm of thoughts churned in her mind. She had long suspected that Marian Creswell's tragic end had hidden layers waiting to be unearthed, and now, it seemed those layers were revealing themselves, one delicate peel at a time. Marian had been a woman trapped, not by her own choices, but by the suffocating demands of a family who valued status over happiness. Her death, so neatly explained away as a moment of weakness, had always felt wrong to Miss Marple, like a puzzle missing its final piece. What if Marian had left behind more than just her final breath in that room? What if she had hidden her story somewhere, waiting for the right set of eyes to find it? The thought gnawed at Miss Marple's mind as she sifted through the details she had gathered, small, almost insignificant things that others would have dismissed. The clock, a gift from a former lover, had been a particular source of interest. It had passed through hands, from Elliot Marston to a distant relative, then somehow found its way to Mrs. Weatherby's household. Its tick, once steady and sure, had become erratic, temperamental, refusing to work for years, almost as though it too carried the burden of a secret. But the connection to Marian was faint, too faint perhaps for most to see, yet Miss Marple understood that in matters of truth, it was often these faint, almost imperceptible links that bore the weight of a revelation. If Marian had indeed left a final testament, it wasn't in the form of spoken words, but in the quiet remnants of her life, things forgotten by all but the keenest observer. It was with this thought in mind that Miss Marple decided to act, knowing the time had come to uncover the truth. The following morning, under the pretense of admiring the late roses in Mrs. Weatherby's garden, Miss Marple found herself standing before the sundial, a silent witness to countless years. Its weathered stone base was more than just a relic of the past. It was an anchor, holding the past in place. With practiced hands, Miss Marple examined the pedestal, her fingers brushing over a faint seam, too perfect to be a natural flaw. She pressed gently, and with the faintest of clicks, the base shifted, revealing a hidden compartment. Wrapped in waxed cloth, yellowed with age, was a letter. Its brittle wax seal bore the initials MC, and without a word, Miss Marple tucked it into her sleeve. That night, in the privacy of her own home, she unfolded the fragile paper, her fingers trembling only slightly. The letter, though aged, was legible. The words, however faded, were clear, written with the calm precision of a woman who had come to terms with the unthinkable. Marian had written of her father's cruelty, of the pressure to marry a man she did not love, and of the quiet attempts by Elliot to help her escape. She spoke of the plans they had made to leave, of a final act of freedom. "If I do not make it through the night," the letter ended, "know that it was not fear but freedom I sought." Miss Marple sat in the silence, the weight of Marian's words settling over her like a heavy fog. This was no suicide. It was a woman trapped, a woman betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect her. The truth, once hidden beneath layers of silence, was now clear, and it was devastating. The next morning, Miss Marple took her tea as usual, her mind working over the implications of what she had uncovered. She wrote 2 brief notes, her pen gliding over the paper with careful precision. Her knitting sat untouched beside her, a symbol of the calm before the storm. The letter was folded carefully, placed into a plain envelope, and delivered into the hands of Mr. Crane, who received it without hesitation. He stood at the parlor window, the morning light casting long shadows over the letter as he read. His expression remained impassive, but Miss Marple saw the subtle sag of his shoulders, the years of restraint breaking with the weight of truth. There were no words between them, none needed. She had seen that expression before in soldiers who had buried their own grief, in widows who had never been wives. It was the quiet surrender of a man who had carried a burden far too long. Later, in a private meeting, Miss Marple handed the full contents of the letter to the village constable, and to Sir Geoffrey, who advised discretion rather than secrecy. The truth was clear. No crime had been committed by Elliot Crane, not by the letter's standards at least. But the weight of what had been revealed could not simply be ignored. Marian's story had not ended with her death. It had only just begun. The 2 spoons had gone unnoticed at first, dismissed as one of those trivial everyday occurrences, things misplaced, easily forgotten. Yet Mrs. Strather, the vicar's wife, always so poised and graceful, could not shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. These were not just any spoons, after all. They were part of a rare heirloom silver set, engraved, irreplaceable, passed down through generations, and treasured in her family for as long as anyone could remember. She hesitated, folding her gloves neatly on the table, the smooth fabric betraying the tension beneath. "I wouldn't mention it," she said, her voice controlled but edged with quiet concern, "if it weren't for the unsettling nature of it all. 2 spoons simply gone." Her words, mild as they seemed, spread like wildfire through the small village, stoking whispers and suspicion where there had been none before. At first, It might have seemed like nothing more than an unfortunate lapse, an item misplaced in haste, a servant blamed, or perhaps even a slip of memory. But the timing, oh the timing was what made it impossible to ignore. Only days earlier, Mr. Crane, the new lodger in the village, had come to visit the vicarage under the pretext of researching for his so-called book on 18th century timepieces. His visit, quiet and unremarkable at the time, now seemed all too suspicious. Miss Marple, who had heard nothing about the missing spoons until now, couldn't help but reflect on how easily rumors took root in a place like St. Mary, how quickly a person could become the object of suspicion, even when they were innocent. Mr. Crane, with his calm demeanor and unfailingly polite manners, might seem harmless enough to the casual observer, but Miss Marple knew better. The stillness of his presence was not the mark of peace. It was the sign of someone harboring secrets, someone who chose his every word and gesture too carefully. To those whose hearts were quick to mistrust, his composed exterior could be mistaken for something far darker, calculation. And suddenly, it wasn't just the spoons that mattered. No, what fascinated Miss Marple was the way suspicion, like a living thing, grew from something so small and insignificant, fed by a stranger's presence and nourished by fear. Crane, the quiet lodger, was now a suspect, a thief in the eyes of the village, though the evidence was scant and the case, so far, was built on little more than a shared meal, and an uncertain history. It wasn't theft that caught Miss Marple's attention though. What intrigued her was the way the web of gossip spun itself around Crane, how quickly a single piece of gossip could transform a man from a guest into a villain. That was the true mystery, she thought, the quiet manipulation of perception, how easily people could be swayed when faced with uncertainty. It was a dance of sorts, one that Miss Marple had seen countless times before. The shift from innocence to suspicion was so subtle, so quiet, that no one would realize until it was too late. And Mr. Crane, too composed and too foreign, had unknowingly stepped into a trap. Then there was Dr. Pendleton, the village physician, a man known for his unflappable efficiency and lack of interest in idle gossip. Yet, even he wasn't entirely immune to the weight of past emotions. Years ago, before scandal had swallowed Marian Creswell's name and reputation, she had been a summer guest at the Pendleton household. Pendleton, then a younger man, had carried a quiet admiration for her, one that was never returned, and barely acknowledged. Yet it was there, visible in the way he spoke her name, in the faint tremor of his voice whenever the past was mentioned. Marian Creswell was a woman whose absence still lingered in the shadows of St. Mary's, and the doctor's tone betrayed a bitterness when her name was brought up. But what truly caught Miss Marple's attention was the faintest change in his demeanor, when Elliot Men's name was mentioned in passing. The tightening of his lips, the subtle disapproval masked in clinical detachment. Miss Marple saw it all. She knew that resentment, once planted, did not need a catalyst to grow. It grew quietly in the heart, buried so deep, that it didn't need action to be dangerous. It only needed time. Dr. Pendleton's disapproval was not rooted in guilt over Marian's death. It was rooted in the quiet resentment of a man who had lost something precious, not to tragedy, but to another man's shadow. And that, Miss Marple understood, was a motive in itself. It was a quiet simmering grievance that had festered over the years, a personal bitterness that, if left unchecked, could easily cloud one's judgment. And then of course there was Claude, Mrs. Weatherby's nephew, whose arrival in St. Mary's had been accompanied by the usual flurry of curiosity. He was charming, in the way young men often are, with an easy smile, and a manner so effortlessly disarming, that it was difficult to imagine anyone suspecting him of anything less than being a perfectly harmless, carefree soul. But Miss Marple, ever observant, saw beyond the charm. There was a desperation to Claude, a quiet edge to his laughter, an emptiness behind his eyes that spoke of something far darker. The village had quickly noticed his fondness for cards, his late nights spent drinking, and the constant, almost deliberate, air of excuses that seemed to surround him. His charm, it seemed, was merely a facade, a mask he wore to hide the mounting desperation that gnawed at him. It wasn't long before rumors began to circulate that Claude owed money, not just to distant faceless creditors in London, but to people closer to home, people who were not easily ignored. He had known Elsie, of course, knew her in that careless, unremarkable way that young men often know a girl, the kind of knowing that was marked by too many stolen cigarettes behind the scullery, and flirtations that never quite crossed the line into something more. But it wasn't that caught Miss Marple's attention. No, it was the way Claude's name seemed to crop up at every turn, how his presence seemed to leave traces in places where it should not have been. He was involved, somehow, though no one could say how, and it was this involvement, this faint scent of wrongdoing, that Miss Marple could not shake. In the end, it was the culmination of all these threads, the missing spoons, the quiet tensions, the hidden resentments, that created a perfect storm. No one was truly innocent, Miss Marple knew. Each had something to hide, something they feared might come to light. It wasn't just about the spoons, it was about the layers of secrets and lies that bound them all together. And in that tangled web, Miss Marple had found her truth, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered, one piece at a time. A single remark, overheard casually near the post office, had ignited a spark of suspicion that spread like wildfire through the village. Claude and Elsie had argued fiercely just days before her death, their voices raised in heated exchanges, with threats lingering like the tension in the air. Mrs. Weatherby, however, was quick to defend her nephew, her tone gentle yet firm, insisting that such cruelty was beneath him. "He has his flaws, of course," she said, "but he's family." Miss Marple, as ever, made no immediate contradiction, but her mind wandered to the quiet cruelty often veiled by family ties, how debt, desperation and old grievances could twist affection into a dangerous form of leverage. She thought of Claude's easy access to the garden, the intimate knowledge he must have had of the sundial's placement. What if Elsie, in her innocent curiosity, had stumbled upon something she shouldn't have? Something that was meant to remain hidden, buried in the past, and in doing so, unearthed secrets far darker than anyone could imagine. Secrets that could make a quiet young man with debts to pay a ticking time bomb. Gossip, after all, was the village's currency, traded freely and without question. Mrs. Crouch, the grocer's wife, had the ear of every soul in St. Mary's, and it was she who had first spread the rumor that Elsie had been blackmailing someone. "I heard it clear as bells," Mrs. Crouch had declared, voice loud and certain, recounting how Elsie had boasted of having proof of something that would fetch her a fortune, enough to leave her life of service behind for good. At first, Miss Marple dismissed the tale as idle gossip, but as always, she knew that in every exaggerated story, there was usually a kernel of truth, something that had been twisted, distorted, but still rooted in reality. Could blackmail really have been the cause? Was it possible that Elsie had found something, perhaps a letter, perhaps knowledge about Mr. Crane's true identity, or some other damning secret about the Weatherby family, something that made her too valuable to ignore, yet too dangerous to keep around? Miss Marple began to suspect that the truth wasn't so much about the maid's death itself, but rather about what Elsie had known, what she had discovered, and what it had cost her. The quiet murder might have been an act of silence, an attempt to bury a secret far too valuable to risk being exposed. A simple mistake, a moment of recklessness perhaps. But it was the possibility that someone, perhaps even within the Weatherby family, had seen Elsie as the cost of their peace, that gnawed at Miss Marple's mind. Her investigation had led her to a quiet conversation with Mr. Grantham, the Weatherby family solicitor, who had revealed a curious detail about the sundial. Though everyone had assumed it was purely decorative, a record showed that it had once been appraised for insurance purposes, and its value, surprisingly high, was noted. What made this significant, however, was the discrepancy in the current value, which was half of the original appraisal. Why the change? Only someone aware of the sundial's hidden compartment could explain it. Miss Marple's thoughts turned toward the past, toward the idea that someone had been aware of what the sundial concealed, and had waited patiently for the right moment to make their move. The final piece of the puzzle came unexpectedly, not through some grand revelation, but in the dirt, the earth itself revealing a clue, when a torn leather glove was found near the sundial by the gardener. The glove was expensive, far too fine for a laborer or maid, and the tear in its palm appeared to have been caused by gripping something rough like stone. When Miss Marple examined it, a chill ran down her spine. She had seen the twin to this glove weeks earlier, in the possession of Claude. The mystery, once muddied in inheritance and secrets, was now beginning to take shape, its edges clear, its truth hidden behind a leather glove, far too expensive for innocence. It was not with urgency or grand theatrics that Miss Marple summoned the key players to her modest tea at the vicarage, but rather with quiet insistence, disguised as nothing more than gratitude for their recent kindnesses. Mrs. Weatherby, Mr. Crane, Dr. Pendleton, Claude, and even the vicar's wife, all accepted, drawn not so much by curiosity, but by the simple pull of village routine. The tea table was set with restrained elegance, lemon slices, anchovy toast, and a plum sponge that Miss Marple casually remarked was just a touch overdone. Conversation flowed lazily from the mundane to the trivial, as it often did in such settings, yet beneath the pleasantries, there was an undercurrent, a tension none of them could name. Then as the moment arrived, it did so not with grand gestures or accusations, but with Miss Marple's soft clearing of her throat. "There is something that needs saying," she began, her voice measured and calm, never pushing, never forceful, but delivering the truth with a quiet finality. In the way she spoke, in the way she presented the evidence, there was no accusation, only the undeniable weight of revelation. The pieces of the puzzle, Claude's glove, the sundial, the debts, the blackmail, the hidden truths, came together not in a single dramatic moment, but in the delicate unfurling certainty that in Miss Marple's hands, no secret could stay buried for long. The air in the room grew thick with a tension that none could ignore, as Miss Marple, with a quiet but deliberate manner, peeled back the layers of a mystery so intricately wound in secrecy. It seemed the very walls themselves held their breath. A hush settled over the gathered guests, not from fear, but from the weight of revelation. Miss Marple's voice, soft yet unwavering, broke the silence like the first drop of rain before a storm. She spoke not only of death, but of the quiet, unnoticed cruelties that bind people in ways far deeper than mere acts of violence, the kinds of small betrayals that twist the human heart. Slowly she unraveled the story with painstaking precision, focusing on a single day. Elsie, the maid, had ventured into Mr. Crane's room, an unusual act in itself. There, amongst the dust and shadows, she had found a letter, tucked away and forgotten in the bottom of an old case, a letter from Marian Creswell, a woman whose past was tangled with secrets far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. This letter, though veiled in personal sorrow, held a confession of defiance, a bold refusal to bend to her father's control, and a declaration of her intent to flee. To Elsie it seemed like nothing more than a forgotten relic of another time, but in her naive hands, it became a key to something far more dangerous. She shared her discovery with Mrs. Crouch, a gossiper of little tact, and in her excitement, unwittingly fueled a fire that would consume her. What Elsie didn't know was the letter's true significance. It didn't just hint at Crane's innocence, it threatened to unearth a scandal long buried, a scandal tied to families with the power to destroy reputations and shatter lives. In her youth and ignorance, Elsie believed this information had value, that it could leverage her escape from servitude, but in truth, she was merely a pawn in a much larger game. Claude, Mrs. Weatherby's nephew, driven by debts that were more than financial, saw the letter not as a relic, but as a weapon. His desperation turned it into something far darker. He had overheard Elsie's naive boasting, perhaps even seen the letter itself, and realized that in the right hands, it could be a tool to secure his own future. But for a man in his position, with the weight of so many burdens on his shoulders, the opportunity to use that leverage became too enticing to resist. Miss Marple spoke of the method, of how a carefully calculated murder had unfolded, not in a frenzy of rage, but in cold, deliberate action. Claude had access to the garden, to the sundial, and to the house's hidden drawers of old medicines. The poison digitalis was not a rare substance, but it was one with a distinct signature. It had come from Mrs. Weatherby's collection, a set of old remedies left untouched for years, now revived for a singular purpose. Miss Marple's eyes locked onto the gathering, and she laid out the events with quiet clarity. Elsie, perhaps promised money, or just a meeting to discuss the letter, had been lured to the garden. She was given tea or sweets, a casual gesture that concealed the deadly dose within. Once the deed was done, Elsie's body had been placed deliberately by the sundial, as if time itself had been an accomplice in her death. The scene too neat, too precise. The shoes, unstained, the lack of struggle, all pointed to a premeditated plan. The truth, Miss Marple concluded, was not buried in the garden, or hidden in the shadows, but in plain sight all along, obscured by the silences of those who had much to lose. Claude had believed he could bury the truth with a quiet confession, but as Miss Marple turned to him with the gentleness of pity, she spoke not in accusation, but in resignation. Desperation, she said, had twisted even the bonds of kinship into something darker. The truth stood before them, unspoken yet undeniable, as silent as the gloves Claude had once carelessly discarded, buried too shallowly for even time to forget. The air in the room thickened, a silent charge lingering in the stillness, as Miss Marple's gaze flicked from one face to the next, her words falling like drops of water on a still pond, rippling through the gathering. The room was not tense from fear, but from the quiet tension of truths long buried, now clawing their way to the surface. She spoke not of mere murder, but of the hidden currents beneath the surface, the memories, the small cruelties, the delicate betrayals that fester in the shadows of everyday lives. Her voice, calm and deliberate, wove a tale of one singular object, a forgotten letter, found where no one would think to look, yet where it held the answers. Elsie the maid had dusted Mr. Crane's room the morning she died, an act of kindness, or perhaps curiosity. It was in the midst of this simple task that she had discovered the letter, tucked away in a hidden compartment, its contents not just a final farewell, but a cry of defiance from Marion Creswell, a woman whose silence had once been a shield and later a prison. The letter spoke of rebellion, of a desperate decision made in the heat of personal turmoil, far beyond the reach of others. Elsie, too simple in her understanding, had seen in it only value, its potential to bring power, perhaps wealth, should it fall into the right hands. She had whispered of its significance, not realizing that she was already standing on the precipice of her own undoing. To Claude, the letter was not just a relic of the past but a key, an opportunity to extract from the shadows something far more dangerous than its mere contents. A family scandal, buried beneath years of quiet shame, could easily be unearthed with just a few well-chosen words, a few strategically placed threats. But it was not the letter alone that made her death inevitable. It was Claude's desperation. An upstanding nephew only in appearance, he had returned to the village not out of familial affection, but to escape the tightening grip of debt that had followed him from London, a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. To him the letter was not a symbol of guilt or innocence, but leverage, a bargaining chip to extract his way from a life of dwindling prospects. Yet what truly set the stage for Elsie's death was not greed, but something darker, a long-buried resentment. Claude had never lived in the light, always a shadow, always second to those whose names carried weight. And now Mr. Crane, with his quiet dignity, his poised restraint, stood as a new reminder of everything Claude had never been, another reminder that he was invisible, that he did not matter. It was not malice, but a need to be seen, to be acknowledged, that drove him to destroy. He had manipulated every detail, from the watch left at the scene, an old relic meant to mislead, to the gloves, torn in haste and buried where they would surely be found. Every detail had been carefully placed, too carefully, as Miss Marple noted with the sharpness only time and experience could afford. The poison, expertly applied, was not a hasty choice, but the result of careful planning, an effort to push the blame onto Mr. Crane, a man already burdened with a past wrapped in murky rumors. And yet as the pieces fell into place, it became clear, Claude's handiwork was clumsy in its attempt to manipulate the truth, leaving behind fingerprints too obvious for the skilled detective to ignore. Miss Marple spoke now of the methodical cruelty behind the murder. It was not born of emotion but cold calculation, an act of deliberate destruction. She turned to Claude with a look that held not triumph but pity, understanding that desperation had twisted his sense of loyalty into a weapon of betrayal. The truth did not need to be spoken. It stood naked in the air between them. As the room fell silent, Miss Marple's voice grew softer, the weight of years of observation pulling the threads of this puzzle together. It was not the grandiose motives that drove him, she said, but the far more common, far more human desires. The desire to be seen, to matter, even if it meant causing harm. In that moment, Claude's silence spoke louder than any confession could have. When the gathering quietly dispersed, Mr. Crane sat unmoving, a letter unfolded in his hands. He did not tremble, did not react, but there was something different about him now, a subtle shift in the air around him. He was not vindicated. That belonged to the public, to the judgment of others. But this letter, this simple piece of paper, held something far more personal. It was the voice of a woman he had once known, now returned to him after years of silence. And as he read, the weight he had carried so long, the burden of an unspoken truth, lifted ever so slightly. It was not the world's approval he had sought, but the quiet acknowledgement of a memory lost to time. When Elliot Merrin left the village, his step was lighter, his chin held a fraction higher. He had not changed, not outwardly, but the tightness in his eyes, the wariness in his movements, had softened. He was a man who had been given something that could not be taken back. In the stillness that followed Miss Marple's quiet dismantling of the web of deceit, the truth lay bare, not in a flood of confessions or dramatic confrontations, but in the subtle, almost imperceptible shift of human nature. The villagers, accustomed to the ebb and flow of secrets, adjusted to the revelation not with scandal or shock, but with the reserved grace of a community that had learned to accept the unexpected. Crane, now unrecognizable as Elliot Marston, moved through the village with an air of quiet dignity, his past no longer a shadow lurking just behind him, but a weight he had finally shed. The watch, the glove, the strange markings around the sundial, each had been a tool of manipulation, carefully planted to mislead, to redirect suspicion, to build a narrative that was never meant to withstand scrutiny. But as the pieces fell into place, as Miss Marple unraveled each thread with methodical precision, it became clear that the true culprit was not the one who had been suspected, but the human frailty of pride, resentment, and ambition. Claude's final act, a desperate attempt to climb from the shadow of his own failures, was not born of malice, but of a wounded ego, one that could not bear to be overlooked any longer. His failure to understand the depth of his actions, to grasp the quiet power of those he sought to manipulate, left him trapped in his own narrative, unable to see the consequences of his desperate moves. Yet, it was not cruelty that defined him, but the haunting need to be seen, to be more than the invisible figure he had always been. Miss Marple, without judgment, saw through the veil of his actions and understood the deeper wound that drove him. And it was not the grand gestures of justice that delivered the final blow, but the quiet moments of reflection, the slow recognition that at last the past had loosened its grip. Elliot, no longer defined by the whispers of others, found peace not in the loud proclamations of vindication, but in the gentle acknowledgement of the truth that had always been his, a truth that could not be silenced, even by the ghosts of his past. The village in its own way embraced him, not as a man redeemed, but as one who had simply returned, a small but significant victory over the falsehoods that had sought to define him. And when Miss Marple, with a quiet smile, remarked on the calm acceptance of nature, that even after storms, a garden would bloom again, she spoke not just of flowers, but of the human soul, resilient and capable of finding peace even in the aftermath of chaos. The sundial, now undisturbed, stood not as a monument to death or scandal, but as a testament to the quiet power of truth, of survival, and of the gentle art of forgiveness. The village moved on, its rhythms unchanged, but beneath the surface, each person carried a quiet understanding that the true measure of a life is not in the grand gestures, but in the small, often overlooked moments where the past is finally laid to rest, and the soul is allowed to breathe once more. The sundial, once a covert symbol of concealment, now stood as a quiet monument to patience, time's true companion. It was no longer an accomplice to hidden truths, but a silent testament to healing. For those who passed by, unaware of its significance, it was simply an ornament amidst the flowers. But for those who knew its story, it marked not the end of a life, but the moment when truth, long buried, emerged once more into the open. The village in its gentle rhythm carried on with such ease that at first glance, one might forget the storm it had weathered. Yet, Miss Marple never forgot, not from stubbornness, but from her deep understanding that the unsaid often carried far more weight than the spoken. Sitting in her parlor, wool in hand, needles clicking steadily as though to match the tempo of her thoughts, she observed the world outside her window, the postman, the children riding their bicycles, the quiet pulse of everyday life. To them the secret had been buried again, but Miss Marple knew better. She understood the peculiar way truth works, traveling not in straight lines but in ripples, in echoes. Marian's voice, once silenced by the overbearing grip of her father and the expectations placed on women who dared to defy, had finally been heard, not with fury, but with calm clarity. Miss Marple wasn't concerned with being proven right. Her satisfaction came not from the spectacle of justice, but from the quiet restoration of what had been lost. A broken name had been mended, not in a grand show of vindication, but through the delicate act of revealing the truth that had always been there, just out of reach. She thought of Elsie, young and bold in ways that only the underestimated could be. Her pride, though it had cost her dearly, had uncovered what would have otherwise remained hidden. And as Miss Marple knitted, she thought of the pattern that slowly emerged, strand by strand, until the chaos became order, and all was revealed. It reminded her of something she had once read, though the source escaped her. Justice is quiet. It does not announce itself, but waits. And as the needles moved, a small smile touched her lips, for justice had at last come to its quiet resting place, no longer waiting. The clock on the mantel, its ticking a soft reminder of continuity, chimed once more, not with urgency, but with a steady assurance. The tea was poured, the shortbread biscuits arranged in their neat circle, and outside, the birds chirped with a contentment that mirrored the calm of the village. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, gazed at the simple clock, its timekeeping unremarkable to most, but precious to her. It had only once failed, during a storm, but since then it had been carefully maintained, its ticking now more meaningful than ever. It reminded her that justice, like time, doesn't always come when we expect it. Sometimes it arrives in unexpected forms, not as a judge, but as a letter, a glove, a girl who knew right from wrong with a clarity others lacked. She thought of Elliot Marston, no longer a man hidden behind a false name, but one who remained even after the truth was revealed. Of Marian, whose voice had traveled farther in death than it ever could in life. And of Claude, who had miscalculated not just the loyalty of his aunt, but also the quiet force of the woman with the knitting needles. The clock ticked again. Miss Marple placed her cup down, satisfied that for now the garden was peaceful, the air calm, and justice, though slow and unassuming, had done its work. She knew another mystery would come in time, as they always did. But for now this small victory in the quiet of her village was enough. For sometimes the deepest truths are not spoken loudly but whispered, carried through silence, loss, and time. In the end, Miss Marple reminded us that justice isn't always swift or loud. It's in the patience of quiet revelations, the gentle return of something once lost, a forgotten letter, its edges yellowed by time and its ink faint but resolute, finally emerged from the long-forgotten crevices of history. Lost for years, buried beneath the weight of secrets and silence, it found its way back into the light, as though the very earth had decided it was time to restore what had been concealed. This letter didn't come with the explosive force of a scandal, or the sharp sting of a betrayal. It emerged with the quiet dignity of something that had waited patiently to be heard. And beneath the garden sundial, an ancient marker of time and secrets, that long-buried truth began to surface, slowly, carefully, with the softness of dawn breaking through a long night. The sundial, once seen only as a humble timekeeper, transformed into something far more meaningful, a silent observer of lives intertwined by fate, whose whispers had been long ignored, but were now ready to be heard. Elsie, in her youthful recklessness, had given voice to a woman who had once been silenced, not by force, but by the weight of an oppressive, unspoken code. In her innocence, she had uncovered the hidden truth that others had long feared to acknowledge. But it wasn't just her voice that mattered. It was the courage in her heart, the bravery of someone who had seen the consequences of resistance, yet still chose to stand firm. The one who had been silent, Marian, had through the quiet strength of her own story, been finally heard, not loudly, or with a cry for justice, but with a soft, unyielding clarity that echoed through the passage of time. And in the midst of it all stood Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, who saw not just the surface of things, but the underlying currents of human nature, the quiet movements of truth that others overlooked. She did not seek satisfaction in being right, nor did she crave the spotlight. Her joy lay in something far subtler, something more profound than victory or recognition. It was the absence of injustice, the restoration of what had been quietly broken, the return of peace to a man whose soul had once been weighed down by exile. She knew that justice, like time, moves not with the urgency of a ticking clock, but with the steady, inevitable rhythm of a natural cycle. It arrives not when expected, but when it is meant to. The sundial, a symbol once of death and finality, now stood as a reminder that time could be a force for good, that truth, when it finally comes, can bring about change in the quietest of ways. Miss Marple knew well that in the world of mysteries, not all revelations come with fanfare or drama. Some come gently, like the steady clicking of knitting needles, or like the soft ticking of a clock that doesn't demand attention but offers continuity, stability, and certainty. As she sat in her favorite chair, her knitting needles in hand, she thought of those who had shaped the outcome of this story, of Elsie, whose bravado had cost her so much, yet without which the truth would have remained locked away. She thought of Marian, whose life had been silenced, but whose voice, though it had never shouted, had reverberated across the years. She reflected on Claude, who had misjudged not just the strength of a woman, but also the quiet power of a woman who understood the subtleties of justice. As the clock on Miss Marple's mantel chimed, its familiar and soothing sound filling the room with its timeless rhythm, she sipped her tea and pondered the question that the letter had brought to light. If you had found Marian's letter, a letter capable of shattering reputations and restoring others, would you have chosen to turn it in, exposing its contents and the damage it might cause? Would you have stayed silent, letting the past remain buried? Or would you have taken another route, one that perhaps even you hadn't expected to take? And what of Miss Marple? Would you have trusted her to see the truth through, to handle it with care, as she always did with her mysteries? Or would you have kept the letter to yourself, fearing what might come from its revelation? In the end, justice arrived, not with the clamor of a courtroom, not with the passionate speeches of the righteous, but with the quiet strength of those who patiently wait, who let the world reveal its truths in its own time. It arrived in the form of a letter, a gesture, and a small act of courage. And so we are left with this question: would you have been like Miss Marple, understanding that justice does not always come quickly, but quietly, as time reveals its secrets, one piece at a time? Or would you have allowed the letter to remain hidden, fearing the consequences of the truth? As you reflect on this, remember that sometimes the deepest truths are not the loudest ones, but those buried beneath silence, loss, and time. If you enjoyed this story of secrets slowly unraveling, of justice arriving not with a cry, but with quiet dignity, share it with others who savor a good mystery. Subscribe for more tales of quiet revelations, of time's subtle power, and of those who, like Miss Marple, always seem to know that the truth, however long hidden, will eventually find its way to the light.